Um, Hello. I'm speaking today to James Cawley from the Independent Living Movement Ireland, and thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this interview. It is part of Ines' work on a special issue of the International Journal of Disability and Social Justice, intended to mark 50 years of independent living in 2022. The topic of the interview and the special issue is independent living in Europe and beyond, past, present, and future. And James, so let's start with some questions about the past and the lessons learned from 50 years of independent living advocacy. My first question to you is, how did you first learn about independent living and what impact did it have on your life?
Hi, how are you? And thanks again for the opportunity, Ines, to talk today. So I think, for me, independent living has been very much rooted in my peer support networks that I have experienced. So I suppose my own impairment, which is called arthrogryposis, it's a long terminology, but we have our own support group on a national level, and I would have met a lot of peers there who would have been talking about personal assistance, about independent living, about going to university when I was a young child, I suppose, and then a young person, a teenager, and then as an adult. So I suppose that's probably where I heard about personal assistance, I suppose, firstly. And I suppose it's important for me to say that I am a wheelchair user and I do use a personal assistance service to live independently. So that was a big key to unlock my independent living journey. So yeah, I think peer support was where I first heard around my independent living journey. And I think still to this day, it's very funny because I talked to some colleagues and peers within the movement, and we often say that we still would ring each other and contact each other on Zoom or telephone to say, this issue has come up about my personal assistance service. So I think peer support is ongoing within independent living, and I think that's important that we remember that as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, James. Now, we're moving to independent, to your work as, as an activist and independent living advocate. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that journey, sort of when you started, and what were your biggest achievements and challenges in your work so far in Ireland?
Yeah, I suppose from a personal perspective, I suppose, again, I'm the youngest of 9 children, so a very big family. So I would say that I was an activist all along. I had to fight my brothers and sisters for X, Y, Z. And again, my parents, I think, were very much brought around a model of normalization in the sense that my disability was never, or my impairment was never treated differently because there's such a big family. And again, there was that peer element there as well, because such a big family, it was like we were peers growing up, and I suppose navigated life that way. And I suppose then, again, with rural Ireland, back in the early 90s, it was very much assumed if you had any disability or impairment that you would be educated through special schools or special education. And again, of course, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with special education, but there was that assumption or that stereotype that this young disabled boy from rural Ireland is a wheelchair user, he's a disabled boy, he will be going to special school. And it was my parents that kind of pushed back and said, well, no, James can go to mainstream education because he has, the capabilities to do that. He might need supports and we'll do that. So I suppose there was challenges there at an early stage from a societal perspective. And I think that really, as an activist now, it allows me to contextualize and that it actually was the medical model very much played out in rural Irish society. And it was the social model that we didn't even know as a family or as, people around me, that were saying that it is actually the barrier. The barriers are created by society structures and systems, not your impairment. And then to fast forward, then my secondary school was really, really a great opportunity and a great journey for me. And I did my leaving certificate to go into university, but I did an access route into education as well, the disability access route to education, the DARE route here in Ireland. And that allowed me to get supports, such as personal assistance, accommodation. And that was also a really great opportunity. I often say I didn't just get a degree in business or geography or didn't just become a teacher. I ended up becoming a full, holistically developed person, activist, independent thinker, critical thinker. So it gave me a really good, solid foundation to go forward with my life, to foster skills such as resilience, etc., that help me now and assist me in my independent life. But one of the major challenges, I suppose, is that when I went from education into employment, because my personal assistance was being funded by the education body, and then I was going into the big bad world of work, I then lost my personal assistance service package in one of my very first interviews. And that was devastating, and that was a massive challenge. And I think this is where I really seen, where I moved from advocacy into collective activism. And I was able to, I suppose, foster my activism skills that I'd learned even in university and all down through the years to try and get this reinstated. So I did contact local political representatives, but I also did go to ministers and try to get through the barriers that way and engage with my peers and the movement. And thankfully, subsequently, my supports were reinstated. And that is a massive, it's a massive thing I'm proud of, but I don't think it should be the way. And I think that echoes the reason why we need disabled persons organisations, that we need a collective to try and eradicate the barriers that we collectively face as disabled people. And I think that's why it's so valuable that disabled people do engage with their disabled persons organisations and do not let anyone speak on their behalf, or do not have disability service providers speak on their behalf. It's really important that we find our peers that saying nothing about us without us. That's really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you say, James, who have been your biggest allies so far? I mean, you mentioned obviously your parents, also the other disabled people, in terms of peer support. Is there anybody else you would mention? And also, are there still people in Ireland who are afraid of independent living that you would mention?
Yeah, I suppose the ally question is really, it's an interesting question, because I suppose I would look at it as, I often talk about the independent living jigsaw. So in order for me to live my independent life and my best life, I need to have an accessible house, accessible transport, my PA service, and lots of other pieces of the jigsaw that fit in. And I think within that, people's intersectionalities, like I'm a son, I'm a brother, a husband, a friend, a co-worker, and I love a bit of fun as well. And I think, so friends is a big thing, who understand and can empathize with you. I think family is, so I suppose it's like the jigsaw piece: family, friends, peers, activists, and also I would say government colleagues, and I would say political representatives, because at the end of the day, I know, for example, quite often people can get very upset or angry at the way the system is, and that's very fair in a personal circumstance. But if we can also look at it from the perspective that political representatives sometimes, or a lot of the time, do want to engage and do want to change the system, and it's us disabled people that can do that. So I would say to any disabled person listening, don't think that, oh, sure, there's no point writing to my political representative. I think there is a point. There always is a point. They need to hear it. And I think strength is in numbers. And I know that sounds very cliche, but it's important that we continue to, in solidarity, not just in disabled persons' rights, but also all the other intersectionalities that we have, because we can be disabled people, but we can also be members of the LGBTQI plus community. We could be members of other communities. And I think that's really important for us to do that. And I forget the second part of the question, sorry.
That's the other part. I mean, are there still people or groups who are afraid of independent living, and who would, you know, be there as a barrier? And
I would say there's people who are quite nervous about independent living, in the sense that, so we know from lots of work that we have done in Independent Living Movement Ireland around, and with Inclusion Ireland as well in Ireland, who's the National Association for People with Intellectual Impairments or Disabilities. And we know that there is many people who are living at home with aging carers or aging parents. And that often is an issue that is looked at from the carer point of view. But when we look at from the disabled person's perspective or point of view, it also is a major concern, because they are thinking that maybe they can't get a house or they can't get personal assistance. I think the main thing in Ireland is that, you know, in line with our personal assistance service campaign, we have 5 asks in ILMI, or Independent Living Movement Ireland, around defining what a PA service is, around legislating for it to get protection for that service, but also investment from the government, because there's one thing having legislation, but we need investment. And then standardization. So Ireland is broken into 9, currently is broken into 9 community healthcare organisation areas, and the funding comes from those 9 areas, depending on the geography of where you live. So that needs to be, I think, centralised. And then the promotion piece. Lots of people don't know about a personal assistance service, and I'm not saying that a PA service is the only independent living support that would sort everyone's lives to live their best lives, but it is one of the supports that is there that needs to be standardized. But also, I feel that there is a piece around disabled people building their capacity to understand what independent living actually is, because lots of people think independent living is living on your own, but it's not just about living on your own. It's about engaging in all the other pieces of the jigsaw, and we all are interdependent on each other, whether you're a disabled person or a non-disabled person. So I think, you know, there is a piece there, but also there is a piece where governments at a national level in Ireland, but also at a European level, need to continuously look to invest in inclusion, genuine inclusion, in disabled people's choices and control, and not giving it to services that actually continue to lock us up. You know, in terms of, we still have over, I think the most current figures are nearly over 1,200 or nearly 1,300 disabled people under the age of 65 in nursing homes in Ireland, and that's really, really worrying, you know, and that has really big knock-off effects as well. So we need to continuously work to make sure that disabled people's capacity is built, their confidence is built, and that they are reassured that they can live independently, no matter what level of support they need to do so.
Yeah. Thanks, James. And what about the role of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? I think Ireland was probably one of the last of the EU, if not the last of the EU countries to have ratified it. Has it made a difference, or is it making a difference in, you know, disabled people's access to rights in your work?
Yeah, I think, you know, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is very, very welcome. And I think it's something we've been pushing for as a country, and activists have been for a very, very long time. I think obviously we need the implementation of the optional protocol, which is really, really important. And I suppose it's important for us to say, it's important for me to say as well, as a policy officer with a National Disabled Persons Organisation, that, you know, we've seen a state report on the convention, and we feel that the state report was quite aspirational in the instance that it lacked clear data on the impact of policies or the voices of disabled people within those reports and policies. And you know, we talked about as well there is a medical approach still to disabled people's lives in our lives, and we are still seen in Ireland as vulnerable members of society. We're still being talked about as people with special needs. And I think that, you know, is also something, the language needs to change in line with the UNCRPD. So I think that's something that anybody or any department can adopt going forward. I think it's important to say that the UNCRPD is there and that services need to be aligned more with the UNCRPD as well, because we know how much control, inverted commas, and it is very much the control that services and structures have over our lives rather than disabled people having the control over their lives. And I think that is really important to state that as well. And I suppose, as I said to you, I do believe that the pillars of independent living currently, you know, and others fit in, and the pieces of the jigsaw are around housing, transport, employment, personal assistance services, education, but also the other aspects of our lives that are intersections of, you know, even family life, etc. And I think the UNCRPD, so for example, Article 23 and 25 and 24 and 27 allow for it to kind of equate into our intersections as humans and allows us to speak about that. And if I can just give a really quick example of that, I know last year that we consulted our membership on the UNCRPD and we did 12 consultations, and some of those topics were around, you know, Article 6, for example, Article 7, you know, so disabled women and young girls, children and young disabled people. We did Articles 9, 20 and 21, which is around access, mobility and access to information. Article 19 around independent living. You know, as I said, Article 23 around disabled people and family life and education, health, employment. And of course, Article 29 around participation of disabled people in political and public life. And I suppose they allowed all our members to actually speak about the issues that are actually impacting their lives. And only for the UNCRPD, I don't know if we would be allowed to frame it in that way. And then there was other targeted focus groups that allowed us to explore lived experience of emotional distress and around liberty and security of the person and integrity of the person as well. So I think that's really important that we are allowed to do that.
So it's clear you are using the UNCRPD a lot yourselves as well. Okay, and James, I mean, I know you're let's say from the younger generation, but do you think I don't know, or do you know if things have changed in would you say things have changed in Ireland in terms of independent living advocacy now, you know, from the kind of maybe not 50 years ago, but, you know, 20, 30 years ago, or have there been many changes in the movement, or have you changed strategies? You know, just the activities, the approach. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I suppose, again, like if you go back to the UNCRPD, as we know, like Article 19 does state that disabled people have that right to live in the community and to choose where they live and with whom they live with. But I suppose the big thing is, again, and I suppose there's one thing, me give my opinion, but going back to that consultation piece, when we look at the consultation on around Article 19, when we consulted the Irish disabled people or movement, I suppose the main thing was that, you know, Ireland, for example, as we know, back in 1992, Martin Naughton, rest in power, and all those the rest of the activists who did start the movement originally set up the personal assistance service for us to have choice, control over our lives. Mm. And that's really, really powerful. And I think we have to remember that that's what the personal assistance service is about and should only be about. Mm. And unfortunately, I think, you know, there has been an erosion of personal assistance and other independent living support by the kind of creeping in of services coming in to call the shots and to decide what we do with our lives. So I think that's why it's so important that as a DPO and as disabled persons movement, that we continue to always build disabled people's rights and the capacity to say, well, no, I'm actually going to take control of my personal assistance service. So I think what I'm trying to say to you is that I definitely have seen improvements as an activist and in my own personal capacity, i.e. I have a personal assistance service. I know lots of people who do. But the one thing I would say is that we are not been adequately, lots of people are not been adequately and appropriately supported to live independently and to do certain things. So for example, you know, people might be given a personal assistance service and it's for, inverted commas again, personal care. But non-disabled people's lives don't end at personal care. Lots of non-disabled people go out then for a walk and they get fresh air. They go for maybe a drink after a week's work. They go to the cinema, to the theatre, meet friends. And that's where disabled people's lives don't seem to be viewed in that way sometimes. That it's just the bare minimum really that we look at. And I think we need to be aware that that needs to be, we need to continue to lobby for that, that our lives, we have different intersections and we also support families and we need our independent living supports to do that. And that came out very clearly in our consultation when we did consult our members last year, that independent living is about having the freedom to have the same choices that everyone else has in housing, transport, education, employment, etc. But it's also about being able to choose what aspects of social, economic and political life we want to participate in. So I think that's really, really important for us to say. And I hope I've made sense there in that kind of.
Yeah, I think, I mean, what I'm hearing is that from the beginning, from the time of Martin and the other activists who are no longer, some of them are no longer with us, they've sort of laid out this about the importance of control, I suppose, choice and control. So you've been built on that. That's what I'm hearing from you. But whereas there was progress, there was also steps back and erosion of rights. We've talked quite a bit about this was meant to be about the past, but the present is creeping in all the time. But just to talk a little bit about, you've mentioned some of the challenges, the barriers to independent living in Ireland. You've mentioned institutionalization, you've mentioned the lack of personal assistance still. Are there any other issues that you would highlight? I know you've done a lot of work on housing as well. Are there any other issues you would mention as kind of the current, the main barriers to independent living?
Well, we only have an hour, right? So
yeah, exactly. It's not a whole day discussion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it could be a whole day. But no, I suppose, just to give, I suppose, a few highlights, if you like, in terms of some of the barriers that are people face currently still. I suppose if we look at even, employment in Ireland, for example, there's always to try we're trying to increase the level of disabled people that participate in employment. And one of the main things is that supports don't always follow the disabled person and they follow the transition. So you have to kind of, when you get a new job or you go through a new transition, you have to reapply and reapply and reapply. Whereas if the support followed James, I would be able to decide again, what I need and be able to bring it with me as well. And that's a challenge. There is the challenge around, as well, this idea that disabled people, and again, this came very strongly across in our consultation piece, where disabled people only occupy jobs and not careers. So there's often initiatives to get disabled people into work, but not careers. This idea that we only start at entry level, but and the UNCRPD clearly states there is a piece there around career advancement. So we need to continuously look at that. And I think that's something that disabled people have said, that we need to look at supports, how we can actually advance our careers and get disabled people, because I know the percentage of people in higher positions or senior positions is quite low, and representation is really important there as well. And I would say as well that there is the catch-22 situation where currently in Ireland we have now a new national housing strategy for disabled people 2022 to 2027. And it does acknowledge that social model language, and it has that thread of social model and human rights approach, and it has 6 themes within that. And some of those themes, one of them does talk about interagency collaboration, but that is something that's really difficult in Ireland, because when you apply for a house, the support is not linked to, so it's not one centralized system. So you can apply for a house and then you have to go off and apply for the support. And quite often the systems don't communicate. So you might get the offer of the house and not have the offer of the support. And then you can't get the house without the support. And then if you don't have the support, you can't get the house. So that's a challenge that needs to be really, really looked at. And it's one that's ongoing, and lots of disabled people experience that all the time. And then I suppose even around, you know, our youth collective, we have the ILM youth collective talked about how young disabled people are not represented around sex and sexual health, and I suppose, you know, consent and them types of conversations were often excluded, and around family life, around reproductive justice, etc. And I suppose we in ILM, I suppose, have done a series of webinars, and our second one was specifically around everything you wanted to know about disability but was afraid to ask. Let's talk about sex. And that opened up a discussion, a conversation, and a dialogue to allow people to actually ask questions and to feel that we are part of that journey as well, and the piece of human life that we all are entitled to be part of as well. And I think that's really important, that, you know, that's said. So there is still a number of challenges, and I suppose there is always going to be the attitudinal barrier where we have to try and eradicate that through our work as DPOs and disabled activists around educating people around the social model and the human rights approach, and that the disability equality and the human rights and equality perspective. And I think it's important that we say as well that there is the challenge of, and I have to say, don't get me wrong, I was involved in awareness raising of my own impairment for years as well. But I think we are gone past the point of raising awareness about impairments now and disabilities, and we need to pull up our socks, as we say in Ireland, and actually engage and embed ourselves in disability equality and make sure that it's done from that approach. And then that's where it's going to allow, I believe anyways, and lots of activists believe, that that's where we want to see a real move and a shift in the way we think about disability, and how we can change the way we think about disability as well.
Thanks, James. And this brings me to the next question. In terms of independent living, is there a perception that independent living is for everyone in Ireland, or are there still groups who are seen as, you know, not deserving, or, you know, just not ready, or whatever the term for independent living?
I suppose I think independent living should be for anyone, for disabled people, for non-disabled people. And I think it's about, again, choice and control. And I think the main thing is that lots of disabled people, as we said already, maybe don't get the opportunity to experience it because there is barriers put up in their way. I would say as well, out of sheer love and respect and all of that, that sometimes family can be a barrier to independent living for young disabled people and for disabled people. And I would say probably more so those who have an intellectual impairment, for example, or an intellectual disability. But again, what I would be saying is that we have to remember that everyone has human rights, and that they should be supported. Anyone should be supported, no matter where they need the support, to being able to live their best lives. And I think that's really important because, again, and I think this in the best sense as well. I don't mean like families as they can do it from a good place, but I've often said this before, where we in Ireland in education we have special needs assistants who assist us in classrooms, classroom assistants, for example. And then other people who can have carers, for example, which is very different from a personal assistant. And quite often carers, sorry, or SNAs or special needs assistants can actually disempower disabled people. And I can say that because I've been a teacher and I've seen, as a disabled person and who was a teacher, as a disabled teacher, I could see some of my students being disempowered by their SNAs, and how that was even taken away, their choice and their control at a very young age, which definitely does have a knock-off effect. And I think that's really important, that we remember that the disabled person has to be supported to make sure that their will and preference, and that they are supported no matter what way, to make sure that they get to live the way that they want to live, or what's best for in their best interest, in line with their human rights.
So would you say, yeah, you talk a lot about sort of the effect of the service providers in a way, yeah, on people's independence. Would you say, as the Independent Living Movement Ireland now, you are able to reach all disabled people, so people also with intellectual impairments or with psychosocial disabilities? I mean, are you do you think you're inclusive of everyone, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think, ILM is very open in saying that we are a cross impairment disabled persons organization. But it's fair to say there's other DPOs as well in Ireland who I suppose lobby government and have collective activism for other impairments as well. And that's important to say as well, because so for example, As I Am is disabled persons organization for autistic people. But yeah, absolutely. Like, I think ILM is always striving to be accessible for any disabled person, and I think we're very strong in that. We say, where we refer to disabled people, this includes all disabled persons, whether that's having a sensory impairment, a physical impairment, or an intellectual impairment.
Okay, yeah, thanks, James. Now, for the final, a couple of questions, looking a little bit at the future. Could you say a little bit about what priorities you think you might have in the next 5 or so years? Would it be the issues that you mentioned, personal assistance, employment, housing, or yeah, anything more specific you could say?
Yeah, I suppose it would be important to say that there is a number of priorities, and I think the big thing here in Ireland is, well, not just Ireland, that's probably a bit of a, it's globally, we know that there is a cost of living crisis,
yeah,
and that's a massive thing, and I think we actually need to recognize that as well. Like, I know, for example, in our pre-budget work in ILMI, we have actually, when we consulted our members again, looking forward, we're saying that ILMI, we did have a national report around the cost of disability, but we're saying there is a cost of disability. It's between 9,000 and 12,000 euro a year or annually. But we're saying that the cost of living report did not take into consideration inflation, and that we need a cost of living payment, or an equity payment. And I think that's something that urgently needs to be introduced by the government. And also, I assume, on a European level, I don't know if you've heard that from other countries and activists around that. So I think looking forward, that's one measure straight away that we need to look at. I think there's always space for equality and human rights budgeting around a need to continue to embed disability in the commitment of equality and human rights, and to remember our obligations as a state under 4.3 and General Comment 7 of the UNCRPD, and to include and to fully resource disabled persons organizations. And I think that's important, because the value of having DPOs is that you're getting the true, authentic voice of disabled people. and that's really, really important. I think going forward, there still needs to be investment in independent living supports. Personal assistance is part of that, but also, like again, in Ireland, we still have no legal right to personal assistance service in Ireland. Like that's really, really 30 years after we've introduced it in Ireland, we still have no legal right. So that's something that needs to be, you know, going forward. And we need to invest continuously into deinstitutionalization to be getting disabled people out of these inappropriate settings and into a house where they get choice control with the supports, the adequate and appropriate supports that they need as well, or a setting that they can live their best lives as well. I suppose then, again, I suppose I said to you, housing, the big thing is there that, you know, when you apply for a house, and again, the thing is, a lot of people, when they hear about housing, they assume that all disabled people just get social housing and that they can apply and they'll get one down in a few years or whatever, and they could be waiting years. But there is disabled people who don't qualify for social housing and do have to privately rent and privately buy. And this also is additional cost in terms of, you know, the cost of living, cost of disability, etc. And I suppose we have systems that don't communicate. And I would like going forward to see that, you know, with that strategy, the housing strategy, that there is that interagency collaboration, not just from a social housing perspective, but in the private rented and private buying market as well, to allow disabled people to fully join the dots or be able to join the pieces of the jigsaw together. And in line with that then is, of course, you know, having housing linked to a genuine inclusive society and community. So we have accessible bus stops, we can get into our local amenities or shops or whatever to be able to engage. And then, of course, you know, there is other, as I said, issues around that I'd like to see, you know, employment open up to facilitate disabled people's careers, not just jobs. And of course, climate change is a massive thing that we need to look at as a challenge, and does disproportionately impact on disabled people. For example, if carbon taxes were introduced, the cost of heating costs us more as disabled people. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of. If there's any government colleagues listening, that they need to be aware of that climate change is impacting everyone, but disabled people are going to get the rough side of the coin in relation to that as well.
Yeah, I think, well, hopefully there will be somebody listening. But yeah, no, thanks. You've set up quite a few issues, and I think they would be really relevant. Yeah, very relevant in other countries as well, at least around Europe. And for the final question, James, I mean, you've mentioned work with the young people before, but what would you say is the role of the younger generations of independent living activists? I mean, should they be playing a role? Are they likely to play a role? Maybe you can say a little bit about that, how you attract younger people into the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, when COVID-19 pandemic happened, ourselves in Independent Living Movement Ireland, we moved very quickly online to support disabled people who have been excluded, you know, and we're not able to engage with people or peers, whatever. So, and we did work to make sure that people were informed and kept in a community in terms of policy, but also in terms of a peer space, but also in terms of a social space. And I think that was important, that we adapted our organization to make sure that we were responding to the policy, the peer, and the social element. So, for example, we had social nights where we actually last year had an online concert where we were able to just come in and shoot the breeze as activists, sit back and relax and, you know, sing a few tunes, and it was absolutely fantastic. And then other examples were where we had different speakers come in on a Thursday night, for example, or and speak about particular topics or areas. And you know, when you think about it, and it's so funny because I said this to you at the start, you know, when I think back on the social nights, they were all around our intersections again. They're all about independent living, because we had a chef in one night who was telling us how to eat well and, you know, what to cook for Christmas, for example. We had, you know, we had emotional distress classes to help us alleviate the pressure of the pandemic and all that. And you know, we had so many different suppose call or Zoom calls that allowed us to become a community, even though we were all apart. And I think that was really, really nice. And of course, our youth collective then, you talked about the youth, our youth collective then are a very willing and active group who do still meet online and do recognise that we as young disabled people need to continuously understand that our rights need to be upheld. And I have to say, I'm very proud that that group does understand that it's not because of our impairments, it's because of policies, structures and systems, and accessible policy structures and systems that actually disable us. And that we need to continuously change our advocacy into collective activism. And I think that's really important for us to share. Because we created other communities, say, for example, when anyone who used a personal assistance service in Ireland was able to meet with us on a peer level, and we used to meet every week and talk about the issues that were impacting us. And that ran for 18 months or something throughout the pandemic, and it just gave people a voice to be able to say. And that group ended up feeding into policy as well at a national level and creating guidelines. So yeah, so I think definitely the online way has really worked in ways in terms of creating that collective space.
Engaging people. Okay, thanks a lot, James. Well, that was the last question, and thanks for all your answers and sharing all this. Just before we close the interview, just a chance for you to say, in case you forgot anything or you want to mention anything. If not,
no, I think thanks a million for the opportunity, and as you probably could tell, I love to talk. So
that's good for an interview.
I enjoyed the interview, and yeah, just to say, if anybody wants any information in an Irish context, they can contact info@ilmi.ie. So that's info@ilmi.ie.
Thanks a lot, James, and I'll stop the recording now.
Bye, everyone.